tonight. She and I go way back. I knew Lane Hudson quite well, and so I will always appreciate them. Because sports has already been alluded to, I like to tell people that during the 1970s, I became a University of Louisville basketball fan. And it actually really started before then. And one of the problems with being my age and being a historian is that I'm always bringing up topics that most people just look at me like, I've never heard of this before. But 2 years consecutively, the state tournament was won in the 1960s by Louisville Seneca, led by Wes Unseld. And I saw him play in both of those state tournaments. The second year, when Wes Unseld was a senior, they defeated Breckinridge County, who had Butch Beard on their team. So both of these folk come to Louisville. This is against the backdrop in Lexington where Adolph Rupp, the coach, refused to recruit black players. And so for 6 years, when I was a student at UK, I could have received tickets for free to go to University of Kentucky games, but I wouldn't go to games back then. But for the record, and because I realize the media is here, I like to tell folks, my favorite team is the University of Kentucky. Right now, I work at the University of Kentucky. My second favorite team is Duke University. I work at Duke and so forth. Louisville is my third favorite team. I have a big heart for Louisville. Also, this is just part of history, and they're focusing, get into the black history stuff. But here's something that I love. My favorite all-time college basketball game on television. 1975 National Championship game, Louisville versus UCLA, right? The winner would play the University of Kentucky, which had avoided playing Louisville for over 25 years. Louisville leads throughout the whole game. And they bring in a person at the end who had not missed a free throw all year, and he missed the free throw. If I was trying to impress you all tonight, I would tell you the starting lineups for both teams. Andrew McCarter, UCLA. David Myers, UCLA. Marcus Johnson, UCLA. Washington, UCLA. Pete Turkovich, UCLA, who had been a teammate of Junior Bridgman in high school. Alan Murphy for Louisville. Bill Bunton for Louisville. Bill Bond for Louisville. Wesley Cox for Louisville. Junior Bridgman for Louisville. Louisville loses 75-74. I was brokenhearted when they lost that game in that regard. But as you know, Louisville would win 3 national championships, and my family in here, my sister, my 2 sisters here, and all we got to see at one of those championship games. So nevertheless, I'm a big time Louisville fan. Excited about the fact that my family is here with me tonight. My wife, Valerie, is sitting over there. We met at the University of Kentucky in the freshman program, and I was so enamored with her that I asked her to marry me the start of our sophomore year. We waited to the start of our junior year, so we've been married 53 years. Sister Scotty, Angela's mother, is here, and Angela may not want to hear this, but I've always been the boss, even though Scotty's older than me. It just is what it is in that regard. And then my baby sister Amanda is here, and her son, and she is a big time U of L fan, and her son Alex is here, and Alex is a freshman here at the University of Kentucky. Now to my job, Black History Month. Black History Month has been occurring since 1915, or 109 years. It started during that time, and I think it was alluded to, one of the worst periods in American history for African Americans. In my classes, I call it the nadir period, the lowest period of race relations. During that time, black people were segregated to the extent of white people's imagination. If white people could think of it, somewhere they came up with every kind of segregation one can imagine. I wrote a book on racial violence in Kentucky where in my appendix, I list over 300 lynchings, but I tell the reader, because I want you to buy what I'm talking about, I throw out over 300 lynchings in Kentucky. Back then, there were books written that tried to justify this mistreatment of blacks. A sociological book, The Negro Abyss. Another one, The Negro, A Menace to American Society. Ideas like this were even espoused in the White House under Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and above all, Woodrow Wilson. It is against that context that Carter G. Woodson and others said that we've got to show a positive image to all Americans, but especially black Americans, about their past. While he deserves the most credit, working beside him was the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. By the way, tomorrow is W.E.B. Du Bois' birthday and my birthday. If my sisters were not here, here's what I tell folk. I tell folk that my mother was in labor on February the 22nd, but she said, no, I'm going to hang out there till Du Bois Day. That's not true. That's not true at all. But nevertheless, that is when Black History Month was conceived. Like many of you, I started attending Black History Month programs when I was 5, 6, 7 years old in elementary school and in church. For me, I was made to go. I did not go willingly. My mother made me go. My minister made me go. The teachers made me go. They made me learn poems. They made me learn the National Negro Anthem. I'm always amazed when I'm at programs like this and they print out the National Negro Anthem for older folk like me. I had to learn that back then, and it's remained in my memory bank. In 1972, when I was a senior at the University of Kentucky, during Black History Month, a local church invited me to give a speech. I actually think I was about their third or fourth choice, and they asked me to speak after no one else would come. But since I gave that speech down to the present, I have given presentations every February for Black History Month. And so I'm really honored to have the opportunity to speak with you again tonight. Needless to say, I firmly believe in the importance of Black History Month for all people. On one year, when I was president, I decided to make the point about the role of whites to African American history. So the 4 speakers I brought in that year, one each week, was a white scholar who had done tremendous work in African American history. We talked about the Jewish scholars who worked alongside Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston in the NAACP to make the point that the whole struggle has also involved white people, Jewish people, all sorts of people for the good of African Americans. Every year for Black History Month, there is a national theme. The theme this year is African Americans and the arts. I mean, it's a very broad topic, and it means you can talk about so many different things. And I suspect, like a lot of you here tonight, I could teach a whole semester's course on African Americans and the arts. I'm going to touch upon several areas, but I realized once I finish speaking, there's going to be somebody here who said, "You didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that, you didn't talk about this. How can you talk about the arts and not talk about this?" First, a general comment or two. I would argue all civilizations in the history of humankind have found ways to express themselves in the arts. If nothing else, they drew certain things. They made certain artifacts. They did certain things. So art has been around as long as humankind has been around. Second point, governments have sponsored the arts. The national endowment in this country. There are various ways our government has sponsored the arts. Governments have also suppressed the arts. The governments have often arrested and even executed artists just for expressing him or herself in that regard. While art, number 3, is important to all people, I would argue that it might be even more important to oppress people, to people who don't have all of the ways that people at the top have to express themselves, whether good or bad. So art has always been important for people at the bottom of society. Okay, so here's where I start getting myself in trouble by mentioning some areas of the art. A very important area for African Americans in the arts, I'm going to call it for the moment the visual arts. These are things that you see in museums, in public places, in parks and so forth. These can be illustrations, these can be paintings, these can be a wide range of things. I personally love going and spending time in museums. My wife, Valerie, and I have been very fortunate that we've been to museums all over the country. Just more recently, there was a new museum called the International Museum that opened in Charleston, South Carolina. We went there last summer. But we've also been to museums in England, in Europe, in Canada, and in 2 very important places in South Africa and in Brazil. Indeed, I love telling people that when I was in the 5th grade, I was cutting up, as usual. Were you ever in school with someone where the teacher said, if no one says anything, I'm giving everyone a recess or something special, and there was this one person who said something? Well, I was always that one person. Well, at any rate, on one occasion, the teacher said, everyone can go outside for recess except George Wright. Now, I'm in the 5th grade. You cannot allow me to just stay in the room. So they send me to the library. I got 60 minutes, so I'm mad and annoyed, but I've only been there 10 minutes. I still have 50 minutes left. I go thumb through some books, and I come upon a book, and I don't understand the language. It's not English, and these illustrations to me are horrible. But I see one of a black woman, and she's got a muzzle, an iron muzzle over her face. And it's horrifying to me. In 2015, Valerie and I go into the African Brazil Museum in Rio de Janeiro, and 16 by 20 is a picture of this woman who had been involved in slave revolts there. This is an incredible museum, only to be surpassed by the Afro-Brazil Museum in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a 5-story museum that documents slavery. Most people forget that 40% of all black people who left Africa ended up in one country, Brazil. Most of those people did not live longer than 5 years because they brought them in wave after wave and these folk died. But equally important is the African American Museum at the Smithsonian that opened a few years ago. A few years ago, 2019, Valerie and I also were at a museum in Melbourne, Australia that documented the life of Nelson Mandela. It was to be a worldwide tour, but COVID got in the way. More recently, this same museum exhibit was in St. Louis, and we went there last summer to see it. So museums have been a great way of expressing that, but also they express everyday life of black people. So that has been a very, very important way. Another major contribution to African Americans has been music. Music, the genre of music just goes in so many different directions. It is wide, it is deep, it is long, and so forth. Music with African Americans goes back to the slavery days. Actually, even on the slave ships. It continues in their work during slavery. It continues in the late 19th century and clearly during the civil rights period. I don't know about you, but I love all genres, but I really love lyrics. Do you all listen to the lyrics in music? And I could give you so many examples, but I'll give you one that I really love. This again will date me. Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Tree of Life, 1976, has a song called Ass. Check these words, A-S. Check these words. I apologize, I have this accent, A-S, ass. He says, I will love you forever. And guess what he says? I'm going to love you until 8 times 8 times 8 is 4. I'm going to love you until dolphins fly and parrots live at sea. Ooh. I'm going to love you until you are me and I am you. You know what I decided? I realized Valentine's Day is already passed, but you can say that to your loved one as a Valentine's Day gift. But if you don't think that's really good, Steve Harvey said, then what about Earth, Wind, and Fire in Love's Holiday? Right? So the lyrics of music. One of my favorite forms of music is jazz. My Uncle David, my mother's youngest sibling, worked after he got out of the military, starting in the late 1950s in Lexington in something called the Narcotic Farm. This was a place where a lot of folk who were addicted to drugs, primarily heroin and cocaine, were sentenced. And there were a number of jazz players. My uncle met Wes Montgomery. And that's where I started with jazz. I eventually grew into the Jazz Crusader. When my uncle passed away, his widow gave me this many, well, maybe I'm wrong, this many albums of his, going back to this period of music. And so I could go on and on. But you know what else in music? I love crossover music. You know what that is? Where black folks sing white folk songs and white folks sing black folk songs. I love Whitney Houston singing Dolly Parton's song. Okay, I think that's beautiful. I love Ray Charles and Aaron Neville singing with a bunch of different white folk. My wife and I argue about this every time the song comes on. She loves Soul Man by Sam and Dave, which was recorded in 1967. Isaac Hayes and David Porter, correct me if I'm wrong, but I love John Belushi and Dave Attenborough. I think that's the song in that regard. But you saw a couple of weeks ago, Luke Combs doing Tracy Chapman. Yeah. So these folks singing together. So you could go on and on with music. A very important art form among African Americans that often sustained them has been humor in the African American community. Interestingly, I started with humor again with my Uncle David. This will date me again. I started by listening to his mom's Mabel and Red Fox albums. Okay. Eventually, I started listening to Dick Gregory. And the whole time I was a college student, I was influenced by Dick Gregory. More recently, I've come to really like Cat Williams and Dave Chappelle. But check this out. Check this out. I went to a Dave Chappelle concert, Valerie and I did, about 4 months ago. It took forever to get in there, and the moment Dave Chappelle came out and lit his cigarette, all these folk around us started smoking marijuana. As if that wasn't bad enough, this young woman sitting next to me and said, "Old timer, do you want to hit?" I said, "This is setting me up." My clothes smelled so bad that I took them to the cleaner because I said, "I'm not going on to the University of Kentucky in these clothes." Right? I set up some kind of alarm or something like that. But let me show you something else about black humor. Do you all remember Eddie Murphy when he whitened his skin in a skit in Saturday Night Live in the mid-1970s? This resonated with us because here's what he did. He whitened his skin and acted like he was a white man. He gets on a bus. There are all sorts of people on the bus, no big deal, but eventually all the Hispanic folk and black folk get off. The bus driver looks around and he brings out wine and cheese on the bus. And it goes on and on. So eventually he goes to the bank and he says, "I want to borrow some money." The person looks around, make sure there's no one black. He said, here's your weekly allotment for being white. That was so powerful because that's what a lot of people believed, that there was something that white people get. Another genre, the last one I'll mention, is film. That film can convey so many different things, and there's so many different ways. Documentaries, and I think PBS is to be applauded, and my fellow historian scholar Skip Gates at Harvard University has done a lot of good things with film that opened up things. I also remember Roots in the 1970s being very important and introducing a lot of us to genealogy and so forth. But there are other filmmakers that I think is important to mention. Spike Lee. I think there's a lot that's important in Do the Right Thing. And if you haven't seen it, I think his Miracle at St. Anna about World War II Italy with black soldiers is very important. But I also think you have to do justice to Tyler Perry and Oprah Winfrey with film as well. I asked my wife the other day, and I'll leave this with you without giving you what is your favorite all-time black movie? Ooh, I got so many in that regard. So art does so many things. When I was president at Prairie View A&M, I tried to promote the arts, especially during Black History Month. I was able to bring in people like Cat Williams and Dick Gregory. But I also decided I wanted students to be involved. So we started an oratorical contest. And winner gets $3,000, the second place gets $2,000, the third one gets $1,000. On one occasion, some students were arrested for defacing the student union by painting, it was a state building, they painted Malcolm X and Martin Luther King on it. It was against the law to do that. But I asked them about it, and I said, they don't really know much about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So I decided to start having a painting contest. And I had them do original art, and I gave them the same amount of money as I gave the other people, and those pieces of art are now in the Prairie View Permanent Collection. As I move to a close, I want to mention two topics that I always mention during Black History Month. Two topics I always mention. One is remembrance and reconciliation, and number two is progress along the way. I I believe that we as Americans have consciously ignored our past when it comes to race. We don't want to talk about slavery. We don't want to talk about the Native period. We don't want to talk about those years when blacks were stripped of all of their rights and so forth. The worst time for people to engage in a dialogue about race is after an incident like Breonna Taylor or George Floyd has happened. Where people need to engage in conversation about race on an ongoing basis. I believe that all of us, all of you, everyone has a right to take part in that conversation. It doesn't matter that I've been a scholar for X number of years. It doesn't matter that you're 18 years old. What matters is if you are sincere and if you're also willing to listen. So part of that is remembrance. The other part is reconciliation. And when I think about reconciliation, I can think about Martin Luther King, I can think about a lot of people, but I think my favorite is Nelson Mandela. Think about his whole life, his struggle to change things. On 2 occasions, my wife and I were fortunate enough to be in the cell where he was on Robbins Island. We've been there twice to Robben Island. Now, we're there on a tour, but I go inside, close my eyes, and try to imagine being there. And then you see the rations they gave him and all of the horrific things. And then you see where they made him work. It messed up his eyesight and all of that. But what did he say once he's out of jail? That South Africa can never fully heal without us reconciling. That we'll find a way to forgive each other. My other theme is progress along the way. Think about when you were born. I'm born after World War II. My father-in-law fought in World War II, and they can't use the restrooms in downtown Lexington that Nazi soldiers, prisoners of war could use. Think about that. That they're denied certain rights. Yet things begin to change in that regard. There's been tremendous progress in my lifetime. Think about an African American as president, a woman of color as vice president, my niece. In her position, what would you all have said in 1960? Oh yeah, she's going to be chief legal counsel at the University of Louisville? No, in that regard. That's not to say that the struggle hasn't been difficult and that it seems almost every time we take a step forward, we take a step back in that regard. But what I believe is that the racism that my grandparents had to endure is not the same racism I have to endure today. That there has been progress along the way to total equality. And that we have a responsibility to keep moving forward. Now I said I had 2 conclusions, but you know what? I go to an African American church. The minister, they always say, as I close, then they close again, and then they say, as I take my seat, I'm always saying, brother, sit down. I have a final conclusion. All of us who are fortunate enough to be at a program like this are challenged by Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and all of those folks to say, what are we doing to make the world better for other people? There are a lot of ways we can do that. I can do it my own way. I suspect if we went around this room, we could do this. Here's something that is not an exaggeration. I am convinced that I have the lowest high school GPA of everyone in this room. I'm going to bet you on that. Because in 1968, when I graduated from high school, I had never made an A in high school. I had made a few B's, but I made a D every time to balance them back off my senior year. I graduated because of something called social promotion. I was mad at the world in that regard. Mad because my father, an alcoholic, had abandoned my mother and us 6 children. Okay. April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. A number of predominantly white universities, including the University of Kentucky, started summer programs for black students. Now, if they were doing it today, they would say underrepresented students. And they said if you come out to UK for 6 weeks and take simulated college courses, we will give you a Martin Luther King scholarship. My future wife, Valerie, goes out there, and they give her a Martin Luther King scholarship. But I brought my transcript on the 3rd day, and they said, we can't do this. This doesn't look right. Martin Luther King, we said we were going to do this. So they gave me a scholarship, but not Martin Luther King. But guess what? 9 years later, I have a PhD from Duke, and it opened up doors that is still open up to me. And guess what? I did not participate at all in the civil rights movement. There were other people who did all of the heavy lifting, and I walked through. So what I like to end by saying with folks, there's scripture to what I'm talking about. John the 4th chapter, verses 37, 38. It says, "'Tis true that some sow and others reap. I sent you to reap, George Wright, where you did not sow. Other people did the hard work, and you received the harvest. I challenge you to sow at this point in your life so that others may reap." I thank you.